Hello, in this video I want to answer the question, did Abraham Lincoln break the US Constitution? And of course, before I start this video, I just want to make clear that I do support Lincoln, and I do think that ending slavery was a right choice, a morally right choice. And the entire point of this video is actually to argue that sometimes just blindly obeying the Constitution is not the right choice. And to me it's even funny that Americans today, when they argue about, for example, guns and the prohibition of certain types of weapons, they all want to return to the 18th century and debate about what the founding fathers wanted. Well, to me that seems absurd. And Lincoln, if we are to believe this law professor at Harvard, Noah Feldman, and also my professor from college that specialized in American history, if we are to believe these two guys, then Lincoln actually broke the United States Constitution at least once, perhaps even twice. And Lincoln simply realized that there are some moral truths that are higher than the Constitution. But what also needs to be said about the US Constitution is that it is somewhat a mysterious document. It is not actually clear whether the Constitution from the very beginning was inspired by this anti-slavery and pro-freedom sentiment, but I'll explain later what I mean, since this is a very difficult and complicated topic. The topic of whether or not the founding fathers actually imagined that one day in the future slavery will be abolished. And those that claim that they did ask us to read those famous first words, and that is, we the people hold these truths to be self-evident, and then all men are created equal. So it would kind of rationally follow from that sentence that slavery is bad. But then again, if we take into account that in the beginning some slaves were white, you could actually argue that the fact that all people could become slaves makes all races equal. But okay, I don't want to get stuck on this question. So I also want to answer one other important question, and that is, did the southern states have a right to secede? Now, just like on slavery, when it comes to the secession, the United States Constitution remains to be a very mysterious document. So those in favor of the Union claimed that it is said in the Constitution that the Union is permanent, and that therefore, case closed. It is said that the Union is permanent, end of story. And that is a rational argument to make from a constitutional standpoint. But some others, also respectable lawyers and constitutional experts, claimed that, as this guy Emmerich de Wattel, I have no idea if I said his name correctly, but this guy Emmerich, he claimed that all treaties, if we look at international law, contain promises that are perfect and reciprocal, and therefore if one side feels that the other side betrayed them, then they have a right to break the treaty. And the southern states did feel betrayed by the northern economic policy. But I'll explain later where the conflict actually began. And what also needs to be said is, if we look at the early United States, local patriotism was much stronger. And here we can see an image from the War of the 1812, where the British managed to burn the White House down. And one of the main reasons that the British were so successful in this war is the fact that many Americans simply refused to go and fight in order to protect Washington. They simply felt like it's not their problem, and many simply refused to serve in the federal military, and just many refused to leave their border because an average citizen back then kind of looked at it, well, it's not my problem. If the British are attacking Washington, it's not my problem. And therefore, it could be argued that the founding fathers actually had in mind this idea that states actually have a lot of liberty and that they have a right to secede. But as I already said, it remains a mystery. And Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist, probably described this paradoxical situation that is the American Constitution in a very good way. He actually said that liberty and slavery, opposite as heaven and hell, are both in the Constitution. And wisely he claimed Constitution is at war with itself. Of course, he was anti-slavery. I mean, you can see that he was black and abolitionist, but he did realize that Constitution was a mysterious document, kind of like the Bible or like the Quran. It wasn't clear what it meant or what the founding fathers actually meant to say. And let me present a counter argument to those that claim that all men are created equal, is like case closed for those that argue that slavery is anti-constitutional. Let me be a devil's advocate for a moment. So the 3/5 compromise is also a part of the Constitution. And what is said in the 3/5 compromise is that southern states, essentially the slave-owning states, get some representatives on behalf of their slaves that are not free. And what's tricky about it is that for some reason the founding fathers refused to use the word slave, maybe because they were anti-slavery and maybe because they did dream that one day slavery will be prohibited. But what's interesting about this formulation is, okay, let me read this part. So if they talk about how the representatives in the Congress of the United States will be given to the states, and it follows, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, comma, 3/5 of all other persons. So other persons, well, who the hell are these other persons? Well, they are slaves. So one could argue that Constitution explicitly mentions slaves, and therefore that slavery is constitutional. And because of this paradoxical nature of American Constitution, the United States from the very beginning were very divided, and some tried to end this division by actually starting wars with other countries. And James K. Polk actually naively believed that starting a war with Mexico will make both the Southerners and the Northerners to forget their differences, and this burst of patriotism will force them to remain united as Americans. And by attacking Mexico, he hoped he will prevent a civil war, but it only worked for a while, because after the new territories were conquered and taken away from Mexico, here we can see the United States military entering Mexico and forcing them to sign a treaty. Well, we can see that the territories were expanded, and that also meant that actually the slave-owning territories were expanded. And this map shows you how the slave-owning states, they weren't happy with the territory they originally had, and they also wanted to expand the territories that allowed people to have slaves, because they were concerned about slaves escaping to free countries, and therefore they wanted to enlarge their slave-owning states. and they were also afraid that the northern states will also outvote them in Congress, which is why they also wanted to expand their slave state territories in order to get more representatives. And the thing about this is that Lincoln didn't start a war with this actually noble idea of ending slavery altogether in the United States. He was just very irritated by by southern folk continuing their expansion of slavery, and Lincoln was simply unwilling to give them to give them more territory, which is why after the southern states proclaimed their independence, Lincoln argued that that secession is anti-constitutional, and he ordered federal troops to remain on southern soil. And then they were attacked at Fort Sumter, as you can see here on the picture. And to be perfectly honest, it remains a mystery whether or not the southern states had a right of secession, but from a purely legal perspective, to me it looks like they probably did. But that doesn't mean that Lincoln did anything wrong. In fact, I think he was right. And morally right, he was. Constitutionally, maybe not, but I'm now talking about morality. And we know pretty much the rest of the story. In the end, as the southern people lost the war, they got occupied, and Lincoln then used his enlarged powers that he received during war to end slavery altogether. And one could also argue that even if starting a war with the southern states was constitutional, well, ending slavery on their occupied territory is definitely very ambiguous, let's say. It probably wasn't allowed by the original constitution, but then again, Lincoln changed the constitution. And one of the great historical ironies is that great reformers often claim to just be doing what their original ideology required them to do. For example, Jesus claimed that he is only that he didn't come here to violate the Old Testament laws, but then he did exactly so. New Testament morality was very different. For example, Christians are allowed to eat pork, the Jews aren't. The Old Testament is all about vengeance, while the New Testament is love your enemy. And Lincoln here actually could be compared with Jesus. He claimed all the time to just be doing what the Constitution required him to do, but yeah, in reality he actually changed the Constitution, but he changed it for the better. That's my point. And this bloodiest war in the American history, and yes, for the Americans it was bloodier than World War II, was actually worth fighting for. And Lincoln was right. Yeah, sometimes we need to break rules that already exist in order to create a better world. And here you can see all those that lost their lives in this great and bloody war. And in the end, General Lee surrendered. And one interesting fun fact about Lee is that after he surrendered, he actually said that he only fought for the South because he was a Virginian patriot, not because he was pro-slavery. And he claimed that now that Virginia is pro-Union, he is pro-Union. And he allegedly said, "Don't build any monuments to me because they will be used as anti-Union propaganda in the future." So yeah, Lee actually said, "Don't build any monuments to me." And yeah, I don't think I have to explain what's funny about it. Let's just say that his biggest fans decided to not follow his instructions. But yeah, that's all actually I wanted to say in this video. A short summary is: did Lincoln break the Constitution? Probably yes, but was he morally right and justified? Yes. That's all for this video, and see you in the next one.